Ko te wai e horara o raukawa moana. Ko te marae e takatora ko te whare pī. Ko koutou a rangatira ko pai nei te pōnei, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. My thanks to the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies for this very kind invitation. I guess I ought to feel at home here in the shadow of Parliament because, as they say in politics, it's dog eat dog, whereas in academia it's precisely the reverse. But anyway, it's a good recipe for humility. And in this lecture in honour of Sir Frank, with his exceptional contributions to both academia and politics, I'd like to offer some thoughts which are well researched, I hope. It's not a matter of laying down the law, but exploring ideas about some matters of national importance. So in 1992, during the Muri Whenua land claim, the Waitangi Tribunal asked me to give evidence on Māori understandings of Te Tiriti o Waitangi when it was signed in 1840. I trained as a historical linguist and had recently published Two Worlds, the first meetings between Māori and Europeans, a book that explored the beginnings of our shared history in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Of course, I didn't want to tackle that task on my own, so I worked very closely with Meri Penfold, who you can see here on the far right, I guess, as you're looking, and Cleve Barlow, just behind her, friends and colleagues in Māori Studies at the University of Auckland. Cleve was a fluent native speaker of Northern Māori, and he had just written a book on tikanga. And Meri was also a fluent native speaker from Tai Tokerau, but she was also a brilliant translator of te reo into English. So Meri, Cleve and I worked through the text of Te Tiriti word by word, drawing on their deep understandings of tikanga and te reo, Cleve's database of early Māori manuscripts, and my own work on the historical records, including the debates at each of the sites where Te Tiriti was signed in the north. One of the first things that we noticed was the use of the term tuku, to give or to release, throughout the text of Te Tiriti, and you'll see it in blue on the screen as I put up the text, a term that was used in chiefly gift exchange. So in the debates over Te Tiriti, each rangatira spoke for their own hapu, weighing up the risks and benefits of forging a closer relationship with Queen Victoria, Governor Hobson and the British. Some drew on direct experience of visits by themselves or the predecessors to British colonies or to Britain, where they'd met governors and monarchs, while others had studied the Bible and learned about governors or kawana in that context. So for the Queen's part, Te Tiriti begins with a statement of care. In her mahara atawhai, her caring concern for the rangatira and the hapu of New Zealand, it says, the Queen has decided to tuku, or give, a rangatira as a kaiwhakarite. A kaiwhakarite, literally somebody that makes things balanced or even, a mediator maybe, to preserve their rangatira, tonga and their land, to bring peace and tranquil living, and to avoid the evils arising from Indigenous persons, ngā tangata Māori, lowercase, and settlers living without law. And in the debates over Te Tiriti, at Waitangi and elsewhere, the rangatira argued over whether or not to accept Governor Hobson as a governor and what that might mean for their people and their mana as rangatira. Since the first arrival of Europeans in Tai Tokerau, the inter-hapu fighting had accelerated through uneven access to muskets. The missionaries were challenging tapu and other tikanga. Unruly settlers from Britain and elsewhere were very difficult to control, and pressure from land speculators was accelerating. Life in 1840 in Tai Tokerau was changing at a furious pace, and for the rangatira, leadership was increasingly fraught. From their speeches, they weren't certain about what signing Te Tiriti might mean. Eventually, however, almost all were persuaded by the missionaries, by Hobson, and by various fellow rangatira to put their trust in the Queen's promises that they and Hobson would be on an equal footing, that their mana, their lands and their tikanga would be protected, and that it was in their best interest to sign Te Tiriti. Pivotal to these debates was the balance between kāwanatanga in Ture 1, or first article of Te Tiriti, and tino rangatiratanga in Ture 2. After a forensic analysis of these terms in many different early documents in Māori, including the Bible, Te Kaipera Tapu, and He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, like many scholars before us, Meri, Cleve and I concluded that in Ture 1, the rangatira tuku or gave to Queen Victoria absolutely and forever the right to have a governor in New Zealand and to govern. This was a substantive gift, but less than the cession of sovereignty in the sense of an indivisible, overarching power claimed in the English draft of the treaty. Henry Williams, the British missionary who translated the English draft into Te Reo, had translated He Whakaputanga 5 years earlier, the Declaration of Independence. And in He Whakaputanga, he used the words kingitanga and mana to translate sovereign power and authority. So kingitanga, kingship, literally the powers of a king or a monarch, and mana to translate sovereign power and authority, while kāwanatanga was used to describe a function of government. It was used as a translation equivalent for that. A lesser power, it said that the rangatira might decide to cede to somebody, a person of their own choosing. The word rangatiratanga was used as a translation equivalent by Williams for independence. So Williams had lived in the North by then 17 years, and he knew it was pointless to ask local rangatira to cede their rangatiratanga. And he'd just come back from Port Nicholson, from here, where he's seen the Tory arrive, and it was buying land all over the place, moving around, and talked to the rangatira about how they felt about what was going on. There was a war that had broken out partly because of those transactions, and he was fearful about what this might mean for local kin groups. I think for that reason, perhaps, he softened his translation of the English draft of the treaty to make it acceptable to the rangatira. Instead of using mana and kingitanga to translate sovereignty as he'd done in He Whakaputanga, he used kāwanatanga or governance instead, which had been specifically spelled out as a lesser power in He Whakaputanga. So in 1992, when we gave this evidence to the tribunal that in Te Tiriti or Waitangi, the rangatira and the hapu had not ceded sovereignty in that sense of overarching indivisible power to the British, the timing was awkward, and our report was quietly shelved. It wasn't until 2009, when the Paparahi o Te Raki claim from the North was mounted, that the tribunal finally tackled this very thorny issue of sovereignty and its relationship with Te Tiriti and tino rangatiratanga. And I was asked for that tribunal to revisit the earlier evidence. By that time, Cleve had died and Meri wasn't well. So with guidance from close colleagues and friends, including Hone Sadler, Manuka, Henare, Patuhoepa, I carried out further research together that upheld those earlier findings. We went through a lot more evidence, and this time too, there was evidence that was given by hapu experts that greatly enriched our understandings of that original text of Te Tiriti or Waitangi and the context in which it was signed. In its stage 1 report, the tribunal itself concluded in an 800-page magnum opus that when they signed Te Tiriti, the rangatira did not cede sovereignty to the Queen, but they did give her absolutely and forever the right to govern in their lands. The interesting thing is that in both of these hearings, there wasn't much attention given to Ture 3, the third article, which was assumed to be a fairly accurate translation of the English draft, which reads, Her Majesty the Queen of England extends to the natives of New Zealand for royal protection and imparts to them all the rights and privileges of British subjects. But when we came to look at that a bit more closely, Te Tiriti actually puts it a bit differently. If you read it in Māori. Here, in exchange for the agreement to kāwanatanga, so this gift exchange is happening in this third clause, the Queen promises to care for ngā tangata Māori o Te Tiriti. So it's ngā tangata Māori, lowercase. That meant in those years, it wasn't a description for a group of people so much as normal, everyday, Indigenous, local, maybe. And tuku, or gives to them, ngā tikanga rite tahi. Tikanga exactly equivalent, rite, that term again. The governor is a kaiwhakarite, ngā tikanga rite tahi. To her subjects, exactly equivalent to those of her subjects, ngā tangata o Ingarangi, the inhabitants of England. So this was her return gift for the gift of kāwanatanga. That's sort of how it's phrased in the text. There are a couple of other things to notice about Te Tiriti. While in the English there's just one definite article, the, in Māori and Te Reo there's two, te and ngā, singular and plural. So when the Queen promised to give ngā tangata Māori o Te Tiriti, the Indigenous inhabitants of New Zealand, tikanga, or right ways of doing things, exactly equivalent to those of her subjects, the inhabitants of England, that gift was made to them as persons, in the plural. Although that phrase, ngā tangata Māori, has often been read as the Māori people or the Māori race in the Lands case of 1987, that's a translation error that comes out of this odd grammatical difference. This insensible slip from plural to singular has contributed to the interpretation of Te Tiriti as a binary partnership between races, or between the Māori race and the Crown, or Māori and Pākehā in the Lands case judgments. So the small grammatical difference between Te Reo and English has contributed, I think, to some constitutional confusion. So when you read Te Tiriti, throughout the text, the parties of the agreement are listed from the first line of the preamble onwards as Queen Victoria, Victoria, the Queen of England, the kawana, or the governor, as a kaiwhakarite, someone who makes things equivalent, the rangatira themselves, the hapu, and ngā tangata in the plural, whether they're talking about ngā tangata Māori, the Indigenous persons, or ngā tangata o Ingarangi, the people from England. And hapu are the largest collectivities mentioned. In Te Tiriti, furthermore, when the Queen gives ngā tangata Māori o Te Tiriti, the Indigenous inhabitants of New Zealand, as persons, ngā tikanga rite tahi, tikanga that are absolutely equivalent to those of her subjects, ngā tangata o Ingarangi, the inhabitants of England. This isn't a relationship of equality and equivalence, not one of identity. It means equivalent, not the same. But the governor sent as a kaiwhakarite, one who creates this kind of equivalence and balance in these relationships. So it's really important to understand that rite in Te Tiriti means equivalent, not the same, as some people argue these days. Equality and difference. As Tamati Waka said in one of the last speeches at Waitangi in 1840, speaking in favour of the governor, you must be our father, our matua. Actually, it's not really father, it's senior relative. You must not allow us to become slaves. You must preserve our customs, our tikanga, it must have been, and never permit our lands to be wrested from us. And then when Nene's elder brother Patuone spoke at Waitangi, he was the last of the manuhiri to speak on that occasion. Bishop Pomparia reported that he spoke, quote, at length in favour of Mr. Hobson and explained by bringing his two index fingers side by side that they would be perfectly equal and that each chief would be similarly equal with Mr. Hobson. So according to this reading of Te Tiriti, When each rangatira signed the parchment, they forged their own alliance with Queen Victoria. And in the Northern Wars that followed 5 years later, when the treaty promises were broken, some rangatira and hapu fought with the Crown and others fought against them. In effect, they each had the right to set their own foreign policy, you might say. And the same thing happened in the land wars in the 1860s, as I guess we all know. So rather than a bilateral partnership between the Māori race and the Crown, Te Tiriti is a multilateral set of alliances in which each rangatira and their hapu gave kāwanatanga, the right to govern, to Queen Victoria, while retaining their tino rangatiratanga, their independent right to manage their lands, their ancestral treasures, and relationships with the Crown. At the same time, the Indigenous inhabitants of New Zealand with their tikanga were placed on an equal footing as persons with the inhabitants of England. And in this arrangement, the mana of all parties was respected. Is this compatible with democracy? I would say so, absolutely, for a number of reasons. So let me just kind of share these thoughts with you. Because in 1840, life in Te Ao Māori was in many ways more democratic than it was at the same time, for example, in Britain. As Frederick Manning, an early settler in the Hokianga, observed, quote, "The natives are so self-possessed, opinionated and republican, that the chiefs have at ordinary times but little control over them, except in very rare cases, where the chief happens to possess a singular vigour of character to enable him to keep them under." Or a distinguished judge of the Land Court, Francis Dart Fenton, "No system of government that the world ever saw can be more democratic than that of the Māori. The chief alone has no power. The whole tribe deliberate on every subject, not only politically on such as are of public interest, but even judicially they hold their committees on every private quarrel. No individual enjoys influence or exercises power unless it originates with the mass and is expressly or tacitly conferred by them." And this surprised a lot of early Europeans who'd come from a much more hierarchical society in Britain. So at a time when European married women did not enjoy property rights or the vote, Māori women inherited land from their parents and grandparents, and female rangatira and tohunga exercised considerable influence. Contrary to contemporary once-war warriors' myths too, European eyewitnesses universally reported that family life in Māori communities was generally affectionate and children were cherished. Oh, Samuel Marsden's vanished. What happened to him? Okay. I quote Samuel Marsden. Samuel Marsden, of course, visited New Zealand for the first time in 1814 and came back many times. And he wrote, "I saw no quarrelling while I was there. They're kind to their women and children. I never observed either with a mark of violence upon them, nor did I ever see a child struck." And anyone that knows about Samuel Marsden, no one would describe him as a bleeding heart. And in 1840, the trader Joel Pollack wrote, "It's not uncommon," this is amazing, having spent a lot of time on Marae, "it's not uncommon to see young children of tender years sitting next to their parents in the councils, apparently listening with the greatest of attention. They ask questions and the chiefs answer them with an air of respect, as if they were a corresponding age to themselves. I do not remember a request of an infant being treated with neglect or a demand from one of them being slighted." And at the same time in the United Kingdom, if you read the social histories, as I've done at great length, in that same period, discipline through the criminal code, as we all know, but also in everyday life, was harsh and often violent. Under the doctrine of coverture, in which women and children were legally covered by their husbands and fathers, the husbands and fathers were entitled and indeed in many ways sort of expected to use corporal punishment as a form of discipline, and married women had no independent property rights. The king or queen was the head of state, and governance was shared between the House of Lords, or the upper house, and the House of Commons. So it was hierarchical in that sense as well. At that time, the franchise was limited to men, and only men with a certain amount of property. So in 1833, in England and Wales, for example, only about 1 in 17 men who lived in cities and towns, and 1 in 24 men in rural areas had the vote, while in Ireland it was about 1 in 26 urban men and only about 1 in 114 rural dwellers who were men had the vote. And in Ireland and Highland Scotland, I've been studying the history of the Highlands quite intensively recently. Imperial rule was brutal. So in the islands and highlands, the Western Islands and Highlands, the Gaelic language and culture was prohibited as one of the, quote, chief and principal causes of barbarity and incivility. And resistance was smashed in battles such as Culloden. Oh, there's the discipline. After which lands were confiscated, and unbelievably, actually, their leaders were hung, drawn, and quartered. This all surprised me when I was studying. And this was followed by the Highland clearances, as many of us will know, the stories of our own ancestors. And my own forebears, who were formerly Shanakri, or keepers of traditional law for the kings of Scotland and the lords of the Isles, were driven from their ancestral lands into exile. So for all of these reasons, Article 3 in the English draft of the treaty, in which the Queen of England gave the Indigenous inhabitants all the rights and privileges of British subjects, it wasn't entirely a gift. Because under English rule, like the Highland Scots, my own ancestors, and the Irish, tangata Māori, especially women, lost many of their ancestral freedoms. And any idea that the treaty introduced modern democracy to New Zealand is mistaken. So when the first election was held in New Zealand in 1853, for example, only men, of course, as we know, had the right to vote. They had to be British citizens, 21 years old or more, and as in Britain, they had to own property over a certain value. So that excluded most Māori, as many of you will know, whose land was communally held. The right to vote was extended to all Māori men in 1867, but it was limited to electing 4 Māori MPs, and to all European men in 1879. In 1893, all women, including Māori women, finally won the right to vote in national elections. But this world-leading shift came in part because Māori women enjoyed property rights and leadership rights at a time when these were denied to European women. At first, New Zealand citizens voted for individual MPs based on their character, their values, and the policies they supported. But around the end of the 19th century, as groups of MPs started to rally around particular policies, political parties began to form. I was kind of surprised by this. I didn't realise it was, a relatively recent phenomenon. Under the first past the post system, or FPP, the candidate in the electorate with the most votes won the seat, as we know, and the party with the most seats won the election. And this soon evolved into a two-party system that often polarised decision-making, and the party that won the most votes did not always win the election. And as we all know, too, in 1993, this was changed to an MMP system, mixed member proportional system, in an attempt to achieve more representative governments. Under this system, citizens, and again, this is calls for Newcastle, have 2 votes, one for a party and one for their local MP. Parties are elected if they win at least 5% of the party vote and at least one electorate, or at least one electorate. And under MMP, one assumes, parties are intended to command influence roughly proportional to their electoral support. And when that ceases to become the case, then MMP becomes problematic. So given this historic background, there are many ironies in current debates around democracy and Te Tiriti. Under the Queen's promises in Te Tiriti or Waitangi, a democracy might have emerged in New Zealand at that time that was actually freer and more accountable and more just than it was in Britain at the same time. But instead of peace and tranquil living, as we all know, there was war, followed by large-scale confiscations of land and harsh cultural repression. From that time till now, that promise of equality, being on an equal footing for Indigenous persons in New Zealand, has not been delivered, as contemporary statistics attest. So my thought is that in Te Tiriti, and I think this thought is probably shared by the royal family, so the honour of Queen Victoria and her descendants is at stake, along with the mana of the rangatira who signed it and their descendants. In 1975, when the Waitangi Tribunal was established to try and make amends for this history of broken promises and uphold the Queen's honour, that was democracy in action, supported by the wider electorate. So throughout our history, there have been these intermittent struggles between those who try to uphold Te Tiriti and the honour of the Crown and of the royal family, and those who wish to disregard its promises. When hapu have united to uphold their mana, for example, in the kingitanga, in the kotahitanga, this has almost invariably been in response to radical breaches of Te Tiriti, for example, in the times of the Northern Wars and the Land Wars, till now. And I think it's very important to try and understand this dynamic. While Te Tiriti itself may be a multilateral agreement between the various rangatira and their hapu and Queen Victoria, the Crown's always found it more convenient to try and deal with hapu in larger groupings, whether it's iwi groupings, the Māori race, or the Māori people. But at the same time, when treaty promises are broken, hapu leaders join together to defend their people. The greater the threat, the wider the net is cast in forging these alliances. And I think this process is also very visible in New Zealand at the moment. So given these converging dynamics, it's not really surprising that in recent times, Te Tiriti has often been recast as this binary pact between the Crown and the Māori race, or Māori and Pākehā, rather than this multilateral set of alliances between Queen Victoria and the rangatira of the various hapu. But this kind of biracial framing does have its dangers. Global studies of a process called pernicious polarisation have examined how self-interested parties may play upon these sorts of divisions by, quote, stoking fears, anxieties, and resentments that then become expressed as hostility, bias, even enmity. By choosing the cleavage or the grievance to highlight, they drive the polarisation to amplify their power. It's a quote. In this sort of process, identities, whether these are political, ethnic, or religious, may be reduced to simple binaries. Left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, black versus white, Catholic versus Protestant, iwi versus Kiwi. In this polarising process, quote again from the scholarship, identity can become all-encompassing as people view those in the other camp with distrust, suspicion, or fear, and cease to interact with them, even segregating themselves in their neighbourhoods, social relationships, and news feeds with like-minded people. The middle ground becomes a battleground, sometimes literally. Moderate voices are silenced, and those with cross-cutting loyalties are cancelled. In the case of politics, this can undermine good governance by making parties much less likely to compromise and to reach a consensus on matters of national significance. And if left unchecked, and this is what the scholarship will tell you around the world, this kind of polarisation can split societies, devastate nation states, wreck their economies, and destroy the lives of their people. This has happened in many, many countries: Serbs and Croats in Bosnia, Catholics and Protestants in Ireland, Israel and Palestine in Gaza, Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda and many other African states. And many analyses have been written about pernicious polarisation in the United States of America at present. And as for the political parties involved in these kinds of processes, and I quote again, incumbent polarising parties typically attempt to govern on their own and eschew norms for bipartisan or multi-partisan decision-making. That may include governing with an absolute majority without consulting the opposition or the wider electorate, forging alliances with smaller, more extreme parties, or governing by autocracy and repression. The thing that is sobering as I reflect on this global scholarship is that no country appears to be immune from this kind of politics. Even here, after the 2020 election in New Zealand, when Labour won an absolute majority, the government did engage in unilateral decision-making on some matters that bore on existing social cleavages, central versus local government, rural versus urban communities, Māori versus other New Zealanders, in some respects. In their turn, other political agents then play upon these divisions. While in the past, genuine grievances and structural disparities have been addressed with bipartisan support through the Waitangi Tribunal, equal opportunities programs, creation of ministries to meet the needs of women, Pacific Islanders, Māori, the disabled. Some politicians now depict these as forms of privilege, stoking popular resentment. I think what the scholarship around the world would tell us that at times of rising tensions, strong democratic checks and balances are vital. In our country, those inside Parliament include the scrupulous avoidance of conflicts of interest, opportunities for public input and informed advice, select committees, and cross-party cooperation on matters of national importance. Outside Parliament, they include a politically neutral public service, independent bodies such as the Ombudsman, the Auditor General, the Waitangi Tribunal, and the Climate Change Commission, a free independent press, an independent judiciary, and universities with their statutory duty to serve as critics and conscience of society. In recent times, though, almost all of these checks and balances have been weakened. Inside Parliament, urgency is being used to avoid public input and rigorous debate. Ministers are awarding themselves powers to make unilateral decisions. Cross-party cooperation on matters of national importance is uncommon. Outside Parliament, the investigative role of the press is being undermined by the rise of social media, which have robbed it of income, and where misinformation freely circulates. The impartiality of the public service is being compromised by political control. The statutory role of the universities as critics and conscience of society is challenged, and politicians are criticising the judiciary and independent bodies, including the Waitangi Tribunal and the Climate Change Commission. And at the same time, increased inequality in power and wealth, along with lobbying and the private funding of election campaigns, undermines democratic checks and balances as well. If wealthy citizens, corporates, and think tanks can gain disproportionate influence through media campaigns, lobbying and campaign donations, and policies can be purchased as part of the electoral process, that undermines public trust and good governance. A combination of these risks and failures is leading to a catastrophic collapse of faith in democracy in many countries around the world, with authoritarian regimes a common outcome. As Benjamin Franklin, another of the founding fathers of democracy, once observed, a democratic government is not established merely by power. There must be maintained a general opinion of its wisdom and its justice to make it firm and durable. So here's some final thoughts from me, or getting towards there, about what would a wise and just government look like in Aotearoa New Zealand. I think in the beginning, a wise and just government would seek a balance between collective responsibilities and individual freedoms, rather than setting these up as ideological opposites. Both are fundamental to a thriving democracy. Polarization around ethnicity or race is also very dangerous. Unilateral decision-making in whatever direction sparks the resentment that can ignite pernicious polarization. Discussions that exclude the descendants of the various rangatira and hapu who signed Te Tiriti, or the descendants of the incoming settlers, are cases in point. Te Tiriti is a relational pact, and all parties involved in its promises must be respected. Once again, it's a question of balance. Rite, equivalence, mutual respect, amity, friendship. A wise, just government would also, I think, pursue long-term policies aimed at delivering thriving landscapes and communities across Aotearoa. In the wake of Cyclone Gabrielle in Te Tiriti, where I live a lot of the time, we have seen how an unholy alliance between lobbyists, politicians, and extractive industries can play out when forestry wastes swept down river, destroying roads, bridges, fences, paddocks, orchards, vineyards, homes, livelihoods, and even lives. Industrial forestry, having lobbied hard and long to avoid environmental controls, inflicted crippling long-term costs on the local community and the regional economy. These sorts of policies are also self-defeating, and this is something to ponder on right now. With forestry companies in Te Tiriti now losing their international accreditation for sustainability and access to key markets. The same could happen to agriculture and horticulture in New Zealand if we're not careful. I think a wise and just government would also conduct its business out in the open. Like many others, I think the links between politicians, lobbyists, and funders in New Zealand is too opaque at the present. It would be good to know, for example, where the funding for a multi-stranded and very costly campaign to rewrite Te Tiriti or Waitangi is coming from. And this seems to be channeled through groups that are not required to report on their sources of income. The same applies to campaign to weaken anti-smoking policies and environmental protections. With well-designed processes, democracy can work at speed. This is not democracy at fault, it's the fault of regulatory design. Furthermore, as we've seen in Te Tiriti, destroying the environment for short-term profit is economically as well as ecologically self-destructive. It's also the opposite of localised democracy, where local people have a real say in decision-making. Under such a regime, the one that we've been looking at in the fast-track bill, with 3 ministers of all the people in New Zealand make final decisions about major projects, the likelihood of conflicts of interest and pork barrel politics is obvious. And I just don't think that any government should be trusted with that kind of power. And under MMP too, the link between the votes that are cast for particular parties and policy outcomes can become tenuous. Small parties hitch their wagons to larger ones and force through policies that at the time of the election attracted very little support from the electorate. This kind of disproportionate empowerment corrodes trust in Parliament and the democratic process as well. So we have to recognise that this is not an issue just for Aotearoa New Zealand, it's happening across the globe at present. Democracy is under siege and the strategies being deployed are well documented in much of the scholarship I'm referring to. Although the authors of the studies of pernicious polarisation offer no silver bullet for combating its threats to democratic checks and balances, they warn that responding in kind with vilification, threats and reprisals only speeds up the process. Rather, they suggest casting light on these sorts of devices and those who deploy them. Greater transparency and oversight of links between funders and politicians, as the Auditor General has just suggested, and the deliberate strengthening of the middle ground through bipartisan policy making with wide civic engagement that reaches across these boundaries and these divisions, well-moderated, inclusive conversations about divisive matters, whether in citizens' assemblies or on marae, or wherever we can come up with our fora. Because here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our ancestors, nearly all of them, I guess, came to create better lives for themselves and their children, including mine. This led to a robust independence of mind, coupled with a sense of social responsibility and the idea of a fair go, a powerful combination. As citizens, we have the right and the duty to demand honest, wise, and fair governance from our leaders, and to help devise solutions to the challenges that confront us. As Peter Tipene has said, up at Waitangi recently, a rangatira is a person who weaves people together. The rangatira must listen to the people. If they do not listen, they will be cast aside. That, I think, is the true promise of Te Tiriti. Instead of trying to divide us, we need leaders who will look far into the future, listen to the people, take the best strands of our ancestral legacies and weave us and them together. What would this look like? I think a lot of it's happening on the ground in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think of the multitude of charities across the country that care for those in need, restore local landscapes, support the arts and sport, and strengthen community networks that go across all of these boundaries. The marae that in times of crisis, whether floods or earthquakes, open their doors to the wider community so people have food to eat and a place to sleep. Or the catchment groups where people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, religions come together to heal our waterways. This is democracy at the flax roots and the grassroots, led by people trusted by their peers, who know how to make a positive difference. It's the opposite of top-down divisive politics where self-interest rules and power and wealth are highly concentrated. I listened to the maiden speeches, many of them, after the election, and I can tell that right across the political spectrum, there are many of these kinds of leaders have made their way into Parliament. I hope they will stand tall and fight for wise, just government in our country, the kind that cares for land and people and binds us together. Nā reira, I aku rangatira. Kia kā, kia toa. Pānui aku mihi aroha ki a tātou katoa. As my mentor, Eruere Sterling, used to chant, whakarongo, whakarongo, whakarongo ki te tangi a te manu e karanga nei, tui, 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 tui ia. Listen, listen, listen to the cry of the bird calling, bind, join, be one. Bind above, bind below, bind within, bind without. Tie the knot of humankind. The night hears, the night hears. Bind the lines of people coming down from long Hawaii, from great Hawaii, from Hawaii far away. Bind to the spirit, to the daylight, to the world of light. Nā reira, I aku rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.